Hi there. Welcome to Tiff Reads Books. I'm Tiff and I read books. And today I want to talk to you about all the Stephen King books I read this year and putting them in an order that makes sense. So I'm going to start and just go in the order of my rankings, maybe. Let's see. How do we want to do this? I'm going to start by giving you my 3 stars. We'll start there. So I read 2 Stephen King books this year I read 16 books in total, and 3 or 4 of them were new reads, and the other 12 were rereads. So the lowest ranked ones that I read this year were Leys Story and Rose Matter, both coming in at 3.25. And Leys Story and Rose Matter both follow female characters and are consistently some of his lowest ranked books, but my reasons for ranking them low are very different. So Rose Matter, we follow an abused woman, a victim of domestic violence, who leaves her husband, who is a very powerful man. He's a member of the police force, and we get a lot of discussion about the toxicity of the police brotherhood. And for that, coming from a book from the 90s was surprising. I'd kind of forgotten that we were having conversations like that back then. Which is just it's been 30 years. Can we fix it? Maybe? Anyway, so, I read this one in high school originally and just reread it. I gave it a lower score, because of some of the tropes used were, pretty uncomfortable. There was some weird talks about mental health. I didn't like the ending. And there was also some pretty racist stereotypes used in this book that I was uncomfortable with. And then Leys Story, again, I rated it a 3. Leys Story, we follow an older woman who is a recent widow, and she's going through all of her husband's paperwork and everything. He was a novelist, and she has a university professor who really wants some of his unpublished work, and he ends up accidentally hiring a man who is stalking Lisey and threatening her. And we also have some issues with her sister having some mental health crises and going through that. And she's kind of dealing with all of this family stuff at the same time as grieving. And overall, I liked the story, but it lowered it for me a lot with the way that the mental health is discussed in the book. These are probably closer to 3.5 now that I've thought about it a little bit more and gotten a little farther away from them. But they sit still as some of the lower books that I read this year. Then the 4s. So I've read a lot of 4s. Let's see. Let's start with the most recent one. I just finished The Regulators last night. The Regulators and Desperation are kind of sister stories. The Regulators takes place in Ohio, in the suburbs, and we basically follow everyone on the street, and everyone is kind of going about their best early spring, summer day, and I think it's early summer because everyone's really hot. So it's best early summer day, and suddenly a weird van comes down the street and starts shooting everybody. And we basically have this survival story of this street who's just being constantly accosted. And we find out there's an ancient evil that is leading all of this. And the town kind of still goes through a dimensional shift, and all of this weird stuff happens. The Regulators is a very weird book. But it's the way the characters interact with each other and stuff that I really enjoyed. It's Richard Bachman, so the ending is even weirder than most Stephen King books, where they just end. So the ending of that was a little off. And then Fairy Tale, I read this year. We're following... This could have been 2 books, okay? This could have been 2 books, and I would have preferred them. The first half of the book, we're following Charlie, who is a teenager, and he ends up helping out his grumpy old neighbor who has a old German Shepherd. And Charlie falls in love with the dog. When the neighbor passes, he leaves the dog to Charlie, and also the possession of a portal to another world. Stephen King loves dimensions and portals and multiverses. Most of the time I am here for it. So the first half of the story, we find out that Fairy Tale takes inspiration, by the way, from hundreds of fairy tales. So the whole book is a love letter to fairy tales, basically. So there's this thing in the other world that Charlie can use to de-age the German Shepherd Radar, and she is the goodest girl, so Charlie wants to do this because he can't lose her. So we get Charlie going on this adventure, and while he does, he uncovers that the world is also being attacked by a extra dimensional evil. So we have that story of him deciding whether or not he is the chosen one and is going to do this. And once he de-ages Radar, he gets kidnapped, put in this prison, and we go through what people have described as a Hunger Games-esque type thing, but it's more just a prison brawl. Like, these guys are pinned against each other in life and death. It's like Squid Games. And they basically just have to like survive these battles, and the last one wins and then has to fight a giant. And that was weird and unnecessary. And then it goes through another arc where they get out of the prison and they have a rebellion and they have to kill the evil king, and it was a lot for one story. But I gave it a 4 because of the Radar being the goodest girly, and the relationship dynamic. Stephen King writes a really good relationship, especially where men can be open and vulnerable. There was a weird closed door sex scene at the end that was completely unnecessary and we didn't need it, but it's Stephen King, so our main character had to lose his virginity at the end of the story. So, and another 4 was The Eyes of the Dragon, so another fantasy, which I really enjoyed this one. I don't remember what it was about it. Oh, I think there was like some weird pacing. And I didn't like that the women in the story were just like there. I'm like, why are they even here if they're just there? Like, there was some weird commentary about them. So The Eyes of the Dragon follows a young prince who ends up getting accused of murdering his father, and he gets locked in a tower. And we have his story of trying to escape before the evil dark wizard can take over and destroy the town, even the village, kingdom. That's the word, kingdom. The kingdom any more than he already has. And so we have some of, I think it's Prince Peter the Good or something like that. We have some of Peter's friends ending up coming together to rescue him, and a really good dog. So whose name? Frisky. Her name was Frisky, and she was actually the hero of the story. And she was just this really cute husky, and there's like a little part written from her perspective, and it was very cute. Frisky was the best written woman in this book. So, and then Pet Sematary, I also gave a 4. Pet Sematary, basically we follow a family who has just moved to northern Maine, and the father has taken a job as a doctor at the university, and they moved to the suburb with a very busy road on it. Our main character ends up becoming friends with the old guy across the street, and it's written as if, I think there's a line that says like, basically he met his father figure, like this man should have been in his life sooner, like, you know, type of thing. And he ends up getting really close to Judd, the neighbor, and Judd starts telling him a couple of things about, you know, the road is really busy, there's a lot of like animal deaths on this road because there's like a bunch of pulp trucks that use it, like big lumber trucks and stuff that use it, and they just fly through here even though it's a residential neighborhood. So of course at one point the daughter's cat ends up getting hit and killed, and Judd is like, don't worry, I got a secret for you, and he takes him to this pet cemetery. So they've already shown them the one where the kids bury their animals and make little signs, but back behind that is an ancient indigenous burial ground where things come back, but sometimes they come back wrong. So we have the whole coming back wrong trope. So Judd takes the main character, whose name I can't remember, up there. He buries the cat, and the cat comes back, but our main character isn't such a big fan about the cat. And so then, of course, as the story goes on, we have something tragic happen to the family, and we wonder if we can use that burial ground again. And it gets really horrific from there. So it escalates. It's very, very slow until it's not, and then it's just lightning quick, everything happening. So a good one, but I don't remember, it just didn't hit fully for a 5 for me. And then The Stand, I have very strong opinions on The Stand. I could do multiple videos of my opinions on The Stand. So The Stand is another 4 for me. Basically, we follow a pandemic which ends up wiping out 90% of the population. And it's like they call it Captain Trips or Tube Neck, but it is a flu that was released from a lab by accident and is extremely contagious and extremely deadly. So, and most people don't survive, but some people do. So then those survivors, we have them kind of joining up, and they form their own society, and they have to go to war against the bad society. Basically, we have a battle of good and evil, using one of Stephen King's favorite recurring villains, Randall Flagg, who is incidentally also the same as Walter O'Dim, who is the villain in The Eyes of the Dragon, and some of my favorite books, which I have one sitting right here, the Dark Tower series. So it's his favorite recurring villain. He's also in Hearts in Atlantis. So there's that too. Yeah, so the story I read, there's two different versions, okay? So I read the really, really long one, which is what Stephen King said that some of his fans referred to as like self-indulgent. And it is very weird to say that a like 1,200 page book needed to be longer, but it needed to be longer because the end was just so rushed. But we get some really wild stories, and we get them from the perspectives of the people who joined the good side and the people who joined the bad side. And it's very interesting that the good side is kind of just like very focused on community, and it's very socialist. Everyone helps everyone out. Everyone gets a piece of everything. And we just kind of work to help. Where the bad side is 9 to 5. Everybody is required to work. You cannot drink or do drugs to excess or anything like that. Otherwise, you will be crucified. So we have like this weird conversation about labor. We have an anti-military conversation. We have an anti-capitalist conversation. We have a anti-consumption, overconsumption conversation. We have so many social conversations in this book, done in a very interesting way. So we got a lot of talks about power dynamic and leadership, and how we treat those in society who are other, and really interesting stuff. Again, a really good dog. Kojak is the best dog, and there's a whole chapter from his perspective, and it was like the most heartbreaking and like exciting thing at like it, and like the dog does not die. Okay, in any of these things that I've mentioned, the dogs don't die. So Radar survives, Kojak survives, Frisky survives. All these dogs survive, and they are the best dogs. Kojak is just such a good boy, and I love him. So, okay, moving on. Joyland is my last. That was a 4. Joyland is a shorter book. It is more of a mystery thriller. It's not really a horror. We follow a young man who is like 21, and he is dealing with the breakup of his first big relationship, and he is really upset that he's still a virgin. And he's writing a lot about that, about how upset he is. This is written as like a memoir type thing. It's like old man writing like his story of his 21st year. And so he decides for the summer he's going to go work for this amusement park. And I did not expect Stephen King to take shots at Disneyland, but he did. So there's some shots against Disneyland in this, which is really funny. So we follow him as he works for this amusement park, and we find out one of the rides is haunted because there was a murder there. And we get these kids, I call them kids because I'm old, we get these 21-year-olds trying to kind of solve this murder. And our protagonist does solve the murder with a twist of who the antagonist is, and he also has made friends with this woman and her son who live next door to where he is staying for the summer, and ends up forming a relationship with them. And some parts of it were really good, and some parts of it I was like, really, Stephen? So yeah. It was fun. It was quick. It was like 280 something pages, which is very short for a Stephen King book, and I recommend it, even though it was just a 4. It was really good. All right, I think that moves us into the 4.5s, which I have Holly, which I just finished. I did a really long video on, but briefly, Holly is a private detective, and she has just lost her mother due to COVID. This book is set in 2021, so we have a lot of pandemic talk. So if you're not someone who can handle that right now, I wouldn't read it. We have a lot of it, so because it is very much set in that time. So she ends up taking a job, even though she's set to be on leave, because it's going to be easier for her to grieve if she can take a step away and focus on something else. So she ends up taking this job to find this missing woman and ends up finding a lot of connecting other missing people and ends up solving that. And it's a very mystery thriller-esque story that was just pretty good overall. Then Salem's Lot is basically Stephen King's love letter to Dracula. And this one, we follow a town. The town is a character that gets invaded by an ancient vampire, very Count Dracula style. It's essentially like, what if Dracula came to America in the 80s instead of London in the 1880s? So it's very interesting. I really enjoyed it. There's so many characters in this book, though, like so many characters that it was kind of hard to keep up sometimes. It reminded me a lot of The Stand, where we get all the characters introduced in the beginning and then we kind of go back to some of them, and some of them we just don't care about anymore. So we get a lot of that, and we get a lot of basically this group of people who are unlikely to come together end up coming together to take on this vampire. And you can kind of ascribe different aspects of the different characters in Dracula to these characters. So we have like our Van Helsing character, and we have our our Mina and all this stuff. And I definitely was making a lot of those comparisons because I read Dracula this year. And I think there's a lot of overarching stuff that's really interesting. So I recommend that one. It could have been shorter. The Talisman was a 4.5 for me, and I really love this one. There were just some weird scenes that I thought were unnecessary, but the Talisman, we follow Jack, who is a young boy who can flip into another dimension. And in that other dimension, everyone has what we call a twinner, which is basically their doppelganger in that world, except for Jack. Jack doesn't have a twinner. And so because of that, he is the chosen one, and he has to save... If he saves the queen, he saves his mother. His mother has probably lung cancer. We're never quite told because Jack is like 12. He doesn't quite know. He just knows his mom was really sick. And he basically has to go on this journey from one side of the U.S. to the other. And he can either do that in the territories or in the U.S. And so we basically have him just doing this cross-country journey, hitchhiking and working odd jobs and all sorts of stuff that a 12-year-old boy shouldn't be having to deal with. So some of it for me was, I think we should have aged Jack up a little bit, and I kind of think Charlie in Fairy Tale was who Stephen King wanted to write Jack to be. So yeah, my favorite character in here though is this werewolf character, and he's such a good person. He just like makes my heart. But it was a really good story. There were some pretty like horrific things that happen to Jack as he goes along this way. So there's a lot of abuse towards a child. So if that's not something you can handle, I had to like put it down for a couple of seconds, because of the ways that some of the people treat him. So then Hearts in Atlantis was a 4.75 for me. There was one story that was just, I just couldn't do it. It's just so weird. Let me grab it. I'm using it for my camera stand. What was the story? I can't remember which one it was, what it was called, but anyway, so it's a collection of short stories, and the first one is the longest. It could have been a novel on its own. I think it's like 260 pages or something like that, and we follow Bobby, and he's a kid in the 60s, and we follow him basically dealing with his neglectful mother, and him making friends with the upstairs neighbor, Ted Brodigan, who ends up indulging Bobby's love of stories and getting him to branch out into different ones. And they do a lot of talking about books and a lot of bonding, but Ted is being hunted by someone. And Bobby's mother doesn't really like his relationship with Ted, which can be kind of understandable from a parent's perspective of an old man making friends with a young boy. So we have that whole relationship of like Bobby kind of having like a coming of age. I think he's 12. It's another 12-year-old. It's like a coming of age story and stuff. And then we get into the second book called Hearts that's Low Men in Yellow Coats. Then we have Hearts in Atlantis, which follows a kid, a college kid, who ends up getting obsessed with a game of hearts. And it's essentially like just kind of a story about what it was like to be in college during the beginning of the Vietnam drafts, essentially. And so we get a lot of conversations about that. And then we have, so all the characters do keep repeating in this book from the beginning. So I'm going to grab this real quick. Okay, did some rearranging, so we're going to cut slightly different perspective now. So the next story, Hearts in Atlantis story, one of our side characters is Carol, who is one of Bobby's best friends in that story. And then that's a story which includes like the beginning of the use of like the peace symbol in Vietnam protests, which is interesting. I'm just trying to find the next story because I think it's the weird one that I wasn't really a fan of. Blind Willie. Okay, Blind Willie was weird as hell, and it followed the kind of villain, like one of the bullies of the first story, who is now come back from Vietnam, and he's married, and he has this really weird life where he like wakes up every morning and he pretends to go to an office, and then once he gets in the office, he goes and he climbs through the air vents and he goes up to an office upstairs, and he changes his clothes and he goes like way down the street to pretend to be a beggar. And that is essentially like the story, and it's so weird, and it's just like little things about his life and him trying to repent for something he did to Carol in the first book. Blind Willie I didn't really like. And then, let's see, the very last book is Why We're in Vietnam is the last one. And basically Carol and Bobby reuniting their other friend, whose name I can't remember. It basically is told from the perspective initially of their third friend, who Carol did kind of like date in some of the other stories, and it is him going to a funeral for a friend of his from Vietnam. So Bobby didn't go to Vietnam, but their friend did, and he signed up willingly and went. And so it's him discussing why they were in Vietnam with his other people who went through that with him, and him talking about the trauma he has and things like that, and then Carol and Bobby reuniting at the end. And it's told in 1999, so each of these stories are from different years. I'm like doing this over here. Each of these stories are from different years, and we get that kind of timeline throughout of the characters. And I really liked that it followed all those characters. This is technically a collection of short stories or novellas, but it really could just be a whole book with time skips and different changing characters. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the thoughts and perspectives on Vietnam from someone who was in college during the time that the protests were happening, and looking at the parallels between that and what happened when I was in college when we were going into Iraq, and thinking about the parallels of that, and how it was handled so differently and everything. So very interesting social commentary in this one. And this is not really a horror or a thriller. If anything, there's some sci-fi elements, and it's mostly just a contemporary fiction with some sci-fi elements. So I really enjoy it. I think it had a lot of good like commentary and stuff on it, so I really liked that. And then we'll go into my fives, so just a few more books left to go. My first five, let me see what my first one was. Dreamcatcher. Okay, so I've talked about Dreamcatcher, and everyone has mixed feelings. The consensus is mixed. I really like Dreamcatcher, okay? So we follow this group of 4 friends who have been going on this hunting trip for years. Every single year they go on this hunting trip together, and they go up to this cabin in Maine. And this year, an alien invasion starts, and it starts with a very weird fungus, and basically we just have people dying in the beginning in very comedy horror types of ways. I've mentioned this in my like Stephen King Winter Rex video, but yeah, weird shit happens. And one of our main characters gets his head kind of taken over by one of the aliens who's trying to put the fungus, which is what grows their eggs, into the water supply. And so he's like hijacking Jonesy, is our main character for that part of the story. He's like hijacking his head, and Jonesy's trying to keep him out. And we have one of our other characters, Henry, who figures out what's happening, and he starts tracking Jonesy. Because it gives everyone telepathy, but our group of friends has a stronger telepathy because of a friend of theirs that they made in school when they were like young teenagers who had a telepathy that gave it all to them. If you have seen the movie, please do not base your opinions of the book on the movie, because the movie is something else. So the book is much better. The overall, I just loved this because it was a conversation about friendship, like, to me, and like the lengths that you'll go to your friends, but it was also like a save the world story, and that just worked so well for me. So take that what you will. I really love Dreamcatcher. All right, and then The Green Mile. The Green Mile is actually one of the Stephen King movies that I forget that actually worked really well, but the book is even better. So we follow a prison warden in the Depression era, and he has got, this man has come onto death row. He's a death row prison warden, or not warden. He's he's the guard, but he's like the head guard of his shift. And so we follow him as he talks about the prisoners that they have at the time. And there's this one man that gets arrested named John Coffey, like the drink, only not spelled the same. And he has been accused of killing and raping these two very young girls. And we get basically the story about how that might not be true. And also the supernatural elements that John Coffey is able to do. And we are basically getting it told as like a memoir again of like an old man writing about this one weird summer he had. So it's really emotional. It's really dark. I wouldn't call it a horror again. It's a fiction with fantasy elements. And also maybe some like thriller elements. We have like a mystery whodunit, more like a mystery. I don't know. It has some elements of different things. It's one of the genre crossing ones. Oh no, I just jumped. Okay. So then we have two more 5 stars, right? 4. Yep. So The Institute was a 5-star for me. We follow a 12-year-old boy who gets kidnapped in the middle of the night and taken to the Institute, where they are studying him because of his mild telepathic ability. And we basically get him surviving and trying to escape and then getting revenge. It's essentially what it is. But there's a lot of commentary on how we treat children, like how we treat people who are other, a lot of conversation on the control that government adjacent corporations have. Very kind of big conversations, but it's also just a escape story. Like, I don't know, I really enjoyed it. It had a lot of elements that I really liked, and I think it did some things that past Stephen King books haven't been able to do very well. I recommend it. And then the last one is Desperation. Okay, so like I said, Desperation is a sister with the Regulators. Desperation is set in the Nevada desert, and we have a bunch of people who are getting arrested at seemingly random, by a cop who is becoming more and more mentally unstable as the story goes on. And we have a little boy who is 12 who has a very strong Christian religious connection with God, and he ends up essentially becoming the leader of this group of ragtag people who are trying to escape horrific things happening to them by this, what they find out is not just a cop, but a cop who was possessed by an ancient evil. And we have a very interesting conversation about the essential slavery of Chinese people in the early American history, which was something I was not aware of until I read this book. And then I remember going to the library and looking it up, and I was like, oh my God, why was I never taught about any of this? So, because I read this again in high school, and this was a reread. So basically, we just kind of follow the story, and some of the most horrific things happen from the get-go. This isn't one where we sit with the characters for a long time and get to know about them. We get to know about them as the story unfolds, and while all these background horrors are happening. And that was just something else. There is a connection in here between the ancient evil here and the ancient evil in It, which is also connected to the ancient evil in the Dark Tower series. So connections galore, if you are into those types of things. So that's all the Stephen King books I read this year. It was my most read author at 16 novels by Stephen King. And I do not regret it. I've read a lot and I don't regret it. I will still keep reading Stephen King. I have some opinions on Stephen King and the sexism in some of the books, the misogyny in some of the books, and whether or not those make the books themselves sexist or misogynistic. And I did just film a thing talking about it, but I think it was so incoherent that we're just gonna stick with this. So for now, I'm gonna redo it. But yeah, so if any of these are your favorites, please let me know, because I'm very curious. If you really didn't like any of the ones that I really liked, also let me know, because I'm very curious. And I'm sure it's Dreamcatcher. If it's Dreamcatcher, you don't have to tell me, okay? I know. Any of the other ones. Right. Today's my day off, but I said I would go to a meeting, so I'm gonna go to a meeting. And I'll see you guys soon.